After the most embarrassing display of pseudo-reality TV ever seen in Washington, or possibly for that matter on reality TV, we now have a Supreme Court nominee in Neil Gorsuch, and I'm referring, of course, to the silly spectacle that Mr. Trump went through with supposedly inviting his two finalists both to come to Washington to keep us all in suspense, although we knew what kind of judge pretty much we would get in either case. But we have a candidate. We have a finalist now, to use a beauty pageant term, and that is Neil Gorsuch. Here to discuss the Gorsuch nomination with us now is Ian Millhiser. Ian's been on the show before. He is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and he is the editor of Think Justice Think Progress Justice at thinkprogress.org. So, Ian, thanks for joining us.
It's good to be here. Yeah, it turns out Neil Gorsuch did very well in the swimsuit competition and the talent competition, and so Trump chose him.
And I want to help the world, and I play the flute. Right. Listen, I have to say, first of all, we'll get into his theories of jurisprudence and that sort of thing, but I really enjoyed your piece in Think Progress, Who is Neil Gorsuch? Including, I have to say, I was really taken aback by his account, Gorsuch's account of how he was so upset when he heard of the death of Antonin Scalia that he wept all the way down the ski slopes where he was skiing. Mm-hmm. If that is not the most Marie Antoinette-ish expression of concern, it's like, I wept so hard my ascot was soggy from my tears. I mean, am I wrong, you think, to have that kind of reaction to that anecdote?
Yeah, I mean, he certainly isn't someone who, comes from a background of depravity. I mean, he has 2 Ivy League degrees, and, there's nothing wrong with going skiing, but it is interesting that, he was so taken, he was so emotional over the fact that Scalia has died. I mean, that Scalia had died. I have admired political leaders as well in my time and have felt, very sad when some of them died. But I think that someone would have that reaction to Scalia tells you a great deal about who Neil Gorsuch is, what kind of judge he's likely to be, what kind of votes he's likely to cast as a justice, and I don't think it's going to be good for the country.
Yeah, and I didn't realize, by the way, and I don't want to, engage in just an ad hominem attack, but I was interested and surprised to learn that he was the son of Ann Gorsuch Burford, who was briefly the EPA administrator under Ronald Reagan, and as you point out, cut staff and gutted anti-pollution regulations and that sort of thing. But let's talk about Gorsuch, the judicial thinker, for a second. Clearly, his attachment to Scalia suggests, an attachment or identification with Scalia's what I would characterize as hard right judicial philosophy. And while they talk about being not liking activist judges, I would characterize it as a very activist view of the judicial branch, but one that is just activist in a very conservative or right-wing direction. First of all, just philosophically speaking, would you tend to agree with that or disagree?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one thing that conservatives did very well over the last 30 years is they figured out how to sell their views as the neutral way of doing things and anyone else's views as judicial activism. But when you look at the history of the Supreme Court, certainly over the last 10 years, both lawsuits challenging the Affordable Care Act were based on theories that, in the words of one judge, had no basis in constitutional law or Supreme Court precedent. The Hobby Lobby case, and Gorsuch, by the way, was on the wrong side of the Hobby Lobby case when he was a lower court judge, or as a lower court judge, expanded the concept of religious liberty to say that one person's religion can be used to attack the rights of someone else. That's something that's never been allowed in the Supreme Court's jurisprudence. So, I mean, these folks have an idea for where they want to take the law. They are willing to, cut out old precedents, and they're willing to take very what the Constitution and what the laws say in order to get there. And I suspect that Gorsuch will continue to bring that ethic to the Supreme Court if he is confirmed.
Yeah, and I think going back to I think that's very important, Ian, and I think going back to the Hobby Lobby ruling, as you said, it was unprecedented in its interpretation in saying that one person's religious views could be allowed to usurp the rights of another person. But it also didn't go further and suggest that a corporation, which is a legal entity and not a human being, can have religious views of its own that can be imposed on living, breathing human beings. Is that I'm not an attorney, but is that a fair interpretation of the Hobby Lobby ruling that Gorsuch supported as a lower court judge?
Well, what the Supreme Court had said prior to Hobby Lobby is they'd said that it wasn't so much a question of like whether a corporation was, whether a particular business was a corporation or whether it was a sole proprietorship, whether it was something else. The notion was that the business sphere was not a place where you could use your religious beliefs in order to exempt yourselves from business regulations. I mean, the seminal case was a case called United States v. Lee, which says that when someone decides to enter the business market, they must be subject to the same regulations as everyone else in that market. And the reason for that was very simple. It was that businesses compete with one another. And if one business is subject to one set of laws and another business is subject to another different set of laws that may, not be as expensive to comply with, then that business gains a competitive advantage. And so you shouldn't get to push out your competitors because you have a religious belief that gives you an advantage in that gives you an advantage in the marketplace. That was the rule up until Hobby Lobby. I mean, before Hobby Lobby, and it wasn't just limited to the business sphere, but before Hobby Lobby, our religion jurisprudence was very concerned with striking a balance between making sure everyone's religious liberty is protected, but also making sure that religion isn't used to take away someone else's rights. Right. Hobby Lobby destroyed that balance, and Neil Gorsuch supported it.
And so what are the implications? I mean, I think that's tremendously important. And by the way, for at least in theory and in better economies, businesses compete for employees as well as for customers. So the Hobby Lobby could also confer a competitive advantage in that way, theoretically. But also the notion that an individual's liberties cannot be usurped for religious reasons in a business environment, critically important in so many different ways. What if somebody says, my religious views, as they've been saying, don't permit me to serve gay people or transgender people or African Americans or Muslims or whatever. So this is potentially, I consider, legal theory aside, I consider a viewpoint like this extremely outside the mainstream of American thought and ideals.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's what the next case is going to look like. I mean, the next religious liberty case probably isn't going to be a follow-up to the birth control litigation that happened in the Obama administration, because unfortunately, it's like that the Trump administration is going to roll back the regulations from the Obama era. The next big religious liberty case is likely to be a case where someone sits down at a lunch counter and, expecting that they're going to be treated just like any other customer, and is told, we do not serve you here because you are gay. Or they try, or maybe it's not a lunch counter. Maybe they want a cake. Right. Maybe they want to hire a photographer. Maybe it's any of the other cases we've seen coming up through the course. But that's what the next big religious liberty case is going to be. It's going to be, we do not serve your kind here. Right. And based on Gorsuch's vote in Hobby Lobby, it is worrisome that he will cast a similar vote in a discrimination case.
Right. So, and I think it's very important that we bring that up. Is there what else? What else should people be tracking about the judicial philosophy of Neil Gorsuch, and what else should they potentially be concerned about?
So I'll flag two issues. One is abortion, because that's always a hot button issue when we're talking about the courts. Gorsuch hasn't ruled directly on abortion, but he did use a very unusual process. I mean, I think he frankly tried to manipulate his court's rules in order to try to cut off funds for Planned Parenthood in Utah. He also wrote a book that was about euthanasia, but that used a lot of the rhetoric about human life and a lot of the same sort of philosophical arguments that you hear from people who are opposed. There are lines from that book that you could take them and you could stick them at a speech at the March for Life this past weekend, and they'd sound right at home there. So
and that's the
I
book.
think when you look at
That's the book.
I'm sorry?
That's the book, The Future of Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia, with lines like, quote, human life is fundamentally and inherently valuable, and the intentional taking of human life by private persons is always wrong. And of course, the conservative standard belief or line is that a fetus is a human life. So that's why you quote those lines. That's the argument that's transferable to an anti-abortion ruling or argument, right?
That's right. I think that Gorsuch, he hasn't ruled directly on, should Roe v. Wade be overruled. But I think when you look at his Hobby Lobby ruling, when you look at what he said in his book, when you look at how he went out of his way to try to cut off funds for Planned Parenthood, when you look at the combination of his record, it paints a pretty clear picture that this is someone who's opposed to Roe v. Wade and is going to be a vote to overrule it.
Yeah, and I believe Trump has said that's a litmus test for him. I may be wrong about that, but that's my recollection.
That's correct.
Yeah. So we have Neil Gorsuch. Now, Antonin Scalia sort of reveled in being, provocative and aggressive and almost crude in tweaking liberals from his position on the Supreme Court. Gorsuch strikes me, I haven't been exposed to him a great deal, but he strikes me as a more smooth kind of character who is likely to avoid Scalia-style provocations, at least during his hearings and his meetings with senators and so on. But we have, for example, heard that, I suppose, to be provocative, he, as a high school student, listed himself as president of the Fascism Forever Club, and some other quotes and things are coming out. How easy a time do you think Gorsuch will have in the nomination, in the hearings for confirmation?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's important to separate, Gorsuch, the personality, from Gorsuch the judge and, Gorsuch's ideology. I mean, I don't really, I believed some very silly things too when I was in high school, so I'm not going to damn the man for that. But, what we know about Neil Gorsuch, the adult, is first of all that he's very, very smart, that he seems very, very personable. He's an extraordinarily effective advocate. And we also know that what he advocates for is a very, very right-wing viewpoint. Not just on the social conservative issues that I was just discussing, but one of his major projects is he wants to transfer a lot of the regulatory authority that the executive branch currently has to the judiciary, so that if the next president wants to put in environmental regulations, they want to put in progressive labor regulations, they are going to have to essentially ask Gorsuch's permission, ask the judiciary's permission in order to have that regulation go into effect. And that strikes me as very troubling. I mean, I think that when he gets to his confirmation hearing, it's going to be easy to be seduced by him. Because I think that he is going to be crisp. I think he's going to be clear-spoken. I think he's going to be handsome. And I think he's going to be charismatic. And that's fine. All that those are great things to be. But the question isn't, is this a handsome, well-spoken man? The question is, what is he going to do to the country? And based on his record, it looks like he does not want to do good things for the country.
Right. I mean, you and I are both handsome and well-spoken as well, but that I would
Of course.
I would expect more scrutiny before I became a Supreme Court justice. So we will have to, unfortunately, leave it there. But again, you know, when you describe his aggressive style of wanting to take over regulatory functions, for example, and assign them to the judiciary, that is not my definition of someone who opposes activist judging. It's someone who is activist in a different direction. And we will be following, of course, the Gorsuch story closely, as I know you will be. So Ian Millhiser of the Center for American Progress Action Fund and Think Progress Justice, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.